This lecture's on the Constitution and the argument about the Constitution. We tend to think about the Constitution today as a kind of holy document of American life, and therefore as something like the Ten Commandments, that it came down from on high and it's unchangeable and it's permanent. But that is really to misunderstand the origins of the Constitution. The Constitution's a political document. It emerges from the political turmoil of its day, and not everybody's happy about it. This idea we have today that all Americans kind of adore the Constitution and respect the Constitution is a post-constitutional development. It's something that at the time was highly controversial, and there were many people that opposed the Constitution. So one of the things I'm going to do in today's lecture is try to explain to you what the opponents of the Constitution thought, because it tells us a lot about the emergence of the Constitution and how Americans understood their liberties at the time. Because the Constitution, the argument about the Constitution is an argument about liberty. And what's going on in the years after the Revolution is an attempt to understand what the Revolution means and what it means to be a free person and how Americans should pursue that ideal. And that's what today's lecture is all about. So we're going to start out today looking at Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams, during the Revolution, writing to her husband, early in the Revolution, writing to her husband, and beginning a discussion about what liberty means. Then we're going to look at how state governments during the Revolution did revolutionary things, how they attempted to, for the first time, to create republican governments and thought about what the idea of republican government might actually mean. And they reached different answers, and that's important to consider. Thirdly, we're going to look at the years immediately following the Revolution, when the federal government is run under the Articles of Confederation, that is, the government set up during the Revolution, and some of the problems with that, and also some of the successes of under the Articles of Confederation. Then we're going to talk about debt and its importance in post-revolutionary society, and how debt leads to social unrest and instability. And then finally we'll be ready to talk about the Constitution, which I'll try to do quickly. And then I want to end with the last kind of rebellion against the New Order, the Whiskey Rebellion in 1793. Okay, today's terms, the Articles of Confederation, they were the Articles of Government that arose during the Revolution, and the Articles of Confederation doesn't really establish a federal government. It really kind of establishes a joint committee of the states to run things. And it becomes apparent by the late 1780s that this really is kind of an inadequate form of government. Shays Rebellion. Shays Rebellion was a rebellion in Massachusetts against the government of Massachusetts, of a bunch of western Massachusetts farmers led by a guy named Daniel Shays. And it's the most famous, but not the only, of the rural rebellions of the time, where people were, especially people in the West, were questioning whether the new governments established during the Revolution were in fact representing them adequately. Successive filtration is a notion enshrined in the Constitution, and that's the idea that we get the best leadership class if leaders are chosen by other leaders. If we elect a president directly, but we have indirect election. If we don't elect senators directly but do the same thing, that the best leaders are going to come from a smaller elite group of voters. Anti-Federalists were the people who were opposed to the Constitution, and as I said, they were much more numerous and important than we tend to give them credit for today. And the Whiskey Rebellion was an uprising against federal power in the 1790s, centered around attacks on whiskey, and I'll explain to you the importance of that when we get to it. Today's themes. First, the argument of the Constitution should be understood as two related things. A consequence of the need for a more stable, powerful federal government, and that's the majority opinion in the 1780s, that we need a more stable and powerful federal government, and a struggle between rural forces and coastal elites. And the rural forces tend to be more democratic, though there are city Democrats as well. And they also tend to be against the idea of more powerful government, whether in the state or a more powerful federal government. So they tend to be the anti-federalists. And then secondly, conservatives win on both counts. That is, that we create a more powerful federal government, the Constitution is ratified, and the coastal elites win in the states as well. Okay. Now let's talk about Abigail Adams. In 1776, before the Declaration of Independence, while John Adams was in Philadelphia as a representative from Massachusetts to the Continental Congress, Abigail Adams wrote him a letter. Now, John and Abigail Adams had a very close marriage. They were each other's best friends. They missed each other greatly when apart, as they were for long periods in their lives, and they kept up a very close and intimate correspondence. So this is part of that. Adams has been in Philadelphia for quite some time, and this is one of the letters they've been exchanging on a regular basis. So Abigail writes, "In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make because of the revolution," they're going to have to make new laws, "I desire you would remember the ladies." Very famous line. "Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." So what Abigail's doing in this letter is using the same rhetoric the revolutionaries have used against Britain to say that women need to be represented as well. We will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. And if they don't get that, we are determined to foment a rebellion. So what Abigail Adams is doing here, I think, is something very simple and something that's a kind of a key process in American history. And that's the idea of proposing that liberty should apply to me, too, should apply to people like me. Abigail Adams does that for women, most famously perhaps. People do that for African Americans around the time of the Civil War. But it's something that once the revolution starts, once this kind of logic that I deserve representation, I have a right to representation, I have a right to participate, is let out of the bag, then more and more people begin to apply it to themselves. And this is, I think, an early and very famous example of that. And that idea of liberty, and that I deserve liberty, I deserve equality, I deserve a voice, that is something that becomes very strongly believed in the years following the American Revolution. And that belief, I think, is the key to the struggles we're going to be talking about today. So what happens with Abigail Adams and John Adams? Well, John decides to take it as a joke. Whether he's right or wrong, we don't know. And he says, when he writes back, "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We've been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that all sorts of people are starting to become rebellious. And your letter is an indication that another tribe, more numerous and more powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented." And then he says, "But look, in practice, you know, we, men, are the subjects. We have only the name of masters, but rather than give up this, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight. So, very famous exchange between a loving husband and wife on the question of female liberty, and whether they took up with that discussion later on, we don't really know. Okay, so the revolution starts, and when it starts, we begin to have these experiments in Republican government. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that states have to write constitutions. They've broken away from Britain. They're no longer colonies. They no longer have royal governors. They no longer report back to London. They have to keep governing themselves, and they have to create mechanisms, governments, so they can do that. And the states write their own constitution. So this is wave of revolutionary constitution writing in the states, and they're infused with the spirit of Republican self-government and what that means and how we can put that into effect in practice. And the different states come up with different answers. We get a kind of period of experimentation. Now we tend to think of all the states as the same today, and they are. Every state has a House of Representatives and a state Senate and a governor, and the governor can veto laws and be overridden and so forth. And there are some variations within states, but you really have to be a constitutional scholar to know what they are. That's not true during the Revolution. The states are very, very different. So let me give you some examples. Georgia, Pennsylvania, and did away with governors. They believed that governors were, or any executive, were undemocratic, and they wanted to have a democratic constitution. Pennsylvania, famously, which was probably the most radical constitution of the time, had a unicameral legislature. That is, they only had one legislature. Why have a Senate? A Senate is a kind of copy of the House of Lords. Why do you want to have a House of Lords, a house of, the elite? If the people are going to govern themselves, let them govern themselves. So let's do away with this notion of a Senate and just have one legislature. And in Pennsylvania's case, they do away with the governor too. So the legislative body becomes the governing body of the state of Pennsylvania. Vermont has universal manhood suffrage, and it also is the first government in the world to outlaw slavery. It has a written constitution that outlaws slavery. Vermont also has universal manhood suffrage. That is, that all adult men can vote. That's a very radical thing in the 1770s. Pennsylvania says that all taxpayers are eligible to hold office. You don't have to be a rich or important man or a big landowner or anything like that to hold office. So Vermont and Pennsylvania are among the most radical of these. On the other hand, Maryland says that the governor has to be a rich man. Had to be worth 5,000 pounds. It's a very wealthy man. Virginia and South Carolina created properly qualifications for voting and for being in the legislature. And believed that the legislature should choose the governor rather than have direct elections for governor. So there are all of these different variations in the period of the Revolution, lots of experimentation. And a lot of this, especially in the more radical places like Pennsylvania and Vermont, is an attempt to build a truly Republican society and to take the idea of self-government very, very seriously. Here's a copy of the Pennsylvania Constitution with all of these handwritten changes as these these ideas are being discussed. And you can see from this that this is a time of very, very intense discussion of what it in fact means to be free, and you might expect that with the Revolution. Okay, during the Revolution and then after the Revolution, for the first few years after, the country is governed by the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation creates a weak federal government. How weak? Well, for one thing, each state gets one vote and only one vote, which begins to cause problems. It means the smallest of the states, Rhode Island, can veto something that every state wants. There's no executive. There's no veto. There is no power to tax, and the government, the United States government that is under the Articles of Confederation, couldn't even regulate trade. It therefore had a very weak currency, and really could influence policy in a very, very limited way in the states. What it could do was run foreign affairs, Indian affairs, maritime affairs. It could set valuations on money. That doesn't really work very well. And it could monitor disputes between the states. And that turns out to be the source of its greatest successes. Here's a map of the country in 1787, and there are two, I think, notable successes under the Articles of Confederation. First is the creation and regulation of the Northwest Territory, and second is it negotiates western borders for eastern states. At the time, states had claims that went back to their colonial charters. Go back to that slide. That let's stick with this one. That they didn't have western borders. So you can see on this chart that Massachusetts has a claim west that they say takes them into Michigan and Wisconsin. Connecticut, the same thing. You can see that in Michigan and Wisconsin. Virginia has a claim as far north as Lake Michigan. North Carolina claims what's all today the entire state of Tennessee. South Carolina claims a strip that goes to the Mississippi River. Georgia claims what's today Mississippi and Alabama. So one of the things that happens under the Articles of Confederation is that these western claims are ceded to the federal government. Virginia has enormous claims. Look at that. I mean, really what's today the entire upper Midwest, as well as Kentucky, is claimed by Virginia. And New York, that red line, is all the territory ceded by New York, or the claims that New York gives up in huge overlap with Virginia, by the way, in 1782. So one of the things that happens in the period of the Articles of Confederation is that the precedent is set that western lands are the federal government's to distribute. That's very, very important. And the other thing that is set during the period of the Articles of Confederation is the creation of the Northwest Territory. This area in green, which is now the upper Midwest, was surveyed, and you can see how it was surveyed into these square townships. And the law was passed for bringing the Northwest Territory into, turning it into states in an orderly fashion in the 1780s. That's a big kind of understated achievement of the period during the Articles of Confederation. But as we've discussed, the Articles of Confederation set up a very weak government, and it becomes apparent, particularly when between about the question of trade between states, that it's an ineffective government. And because of that, the call for a constitution begins to be raised. Okay, but now I want to go and talk about another issue that's happening at the same time that I think has a lot to do with the creation of the Constitution. And that's the issue of debt. And debt influences politics. One of the things the federal government's very ineffective at, and the states turn out to be ineffective at it too, is creating a stable currency. You can see here that Rhode Island tries this state paper money. It becomes utterly worthless. More importantly, the money issued by the Continental Congress is very unstable as well. So there's a lot of inflation during this period, and there's also a lack of ready cash around, which means it's very, very difficult for poorer people to pay their taxes. And that begins to be an issue in state after state. In the years after the Revolution, a lot of poorer people, particularly the rural poor, begin to lose their lands because they can't pay debts and because they can't pay taxes. And this, as you can imagine, causes a lot of rural discontent. The most famous incidents of which happen in Massachusetts. In 1786, there's an attempt to close the court in Springfield, Massachusetts. Now, why would that be the case? Well, the reason people want to close courts, debtors want to close courts, is because courts are the places where you go to have laws enforced. So if you are, somebody owes you money and you want to get paid, what you do is you go to court and prove that this money is owed to you, and the court decrees that this person has to pay it. There are so many poor farmers in western Massachusetts that are in debt that they attempt to close the court. The logic being that if a court can't order money to be collected, then it can't be collected and the farmers will be saved. So there's an attempt to shut down the legal system. It's a desperate idea. But that shows you how desperate the situation is in Massachusetts in 1786. And out of that comes what becomes known as Shays' Rebellion. And here's the only image we have of Daniel Shays, leader of Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays is a former revolutionary soldier. He is a western Massachusetts farmer. He is in debt. He feels that the state government hasn't been very responsive to the problems of people like himself, and he begins to lead this revolt against the government of Massachusetts, which is first just a kind of tax revolt, but turns into a real armed revolt in 1786. Here's the governor's proclamation. I have therefore sought fit to issue this proclamation causing all sorts of judges, justice, sheriffs, constables, and other officers, civil and military, basically mobilizes the state militia within this Commonwealth to prevent and suppress all such violence and riotous proceedings if they should be attempted in their several counties. So the governor of Massachusetts goes to war with these rebels in September of 1786, and the militia wins. There's an actual battle at Springfield, Massachusetts. There's an armory in Springfield, and the rebels are attempting to get guns. And there's a fight there, and the militia wins, and the rebellion's effectively over. So Shays' Rebellion doesn't turn out to be much of a success, but what it does do is scare the people who are paying attention. Daniel Shays said that one moment of liberty is likely to be worth an eternity of bondage. he said, liberty before death, liberty or death. And that scares people like James Madison a lot. This is what Madison has to say. Liberty may be endangered by the abuses of liberty as well as the abuses of power. It's almost the opposite of the rhetoric we're getting in the Revolution. Madison says he's worried about what he called the late turbulent scenes in Massachusetts, and says that we need a constitution because a constitution is a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to Republican government. Now, what does he mean by diseases most incident to Republican government? He means that rebellion. He means that this notion of liberty, Abigail Adams' notion of liberty, that people have a right to be represented, everybody does, and they have a right to their liberty, everybody does. Madison thinks that this is a dangerous idea. He thinks it's going to lead to all kinds of rebellion, and that it's going to lead to chaos. And we better do something to make sure that doesn't happen. The people who run things, the people who are responsible, have to keep this rabble from running things. John Adams, Abigail's husband, said that the people of education, talents, virtues, and property of the country have to get together and create a stable government. And that's what they do when they write the Constitution.